Having children and raising them, is it now a rebellious act? Infamous natalist Malcolm Collins joins us now. I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. Malcolm Collins is an entrepreneur, author, and advocate for pronatalism and education reform. He hosts a podcast, Based Camp. Get it? With his wife, Simone. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hello, it is so exciting to be here with you today.
I feel the excitement. I feel it deep down within. I mean, we are in really treacherous territory right now, talking about the idea that people should have children and raise them.
Oh, God. Yeah. Every time, I've been talking about this for years at this point. And at first, everyone was like, you are absolutely insane. You must be some sort of crazy fascist for saying we should have more children.
Yeah.
This clearly isn't an issue. And as time has gone on, there's been this shift in the narrative, which is like, okay, I guess fertility collapse is happening, but it's not an issue for these reasons, and everyone who cares about it is evil for these reasons.
So let's talk about the collapse, because it's not just here. I mean, South Korea is obviously a prominent example. How bad is it? How wide-reaching is it? And how fast is it going to take effect?
It's so much worse than people think. So if you look at the United States, if you project forwards the decline in fertility rate we have had in the past 10 years, and you assume one generation every 30 years, for every 100 Americans, there's only going to be around 4.3 great-grandchildren. And people are like, oh, we can solve this with immigration. But it's like, immigration from where? Latin America, so Central America, South America, and the Caribbean collectively fell below repopulation rate by the UN's own statistics. And they famously inflate these all the way back in 2019. And the UN has been trying to hide how bad this situation is, as to why we can get to later. But in 2019, they commissioned this report being like, oh, well, in the second half of this century, Latin America's fertility rate's going to level off at around 1.75. Well, there was this great article that dug deep into this in America's Quarterly called Latin America's Fertility Decline is Accelerating, No One's Certain Why. And it showed that of the countries that they were looking at in their survey, all but one, just 5 years later, had fallen below that 1.75 number, with a number of countries in Latin America falling to around the 1.3 number or below it that we thought was basically impossible outside of the developed world. You have countries like Uruguay where in just the past 7 years, they have fallen from above repopulation rate, 2.1, to below 1.3. You have countries like Argentina, where if you look at the people going into the class, kindergarten, 4-year-olds, this coming year, 2024, or this year, 2024, it's going to be 30% lower than the number that were coming in just 4 years ago. You can look at countries like Costa Rica, where a local demographer declined their fertility situation as vertiginous, where it looks like for native-born Costa Rican women, they may have already fallen below the 1 number, which means their population rate is halving every generation. And people are like, how do you know this is going to continue to get worse? Well, one, I can look at the leading numbers. In the United States, only 45% of young women, by a recent Pew survey, said they wanted to have kids. That means that they would have to have over 4 kids each just to keep the population stable. And let's be honest, we know they're not even going to have 2 kids each. You can look at falling rates of religiosity, which is like the number one correlate of fertility, and it has been dropping vertiginous in Gen Alpha. Or we can look at countries that are further along on this timeline than us. You look at a country like South Korea, which is where I was living when I started caring about this issue, and at their current fertility rate, not their projected fertility rate, even if it doesn't continue to decline, for every 100 South Koreans, there's only going to be 6 great-grandchildren. And that's a comical statement to make, because year over year, their fertility rate fell 11.5% this last year, and 60% of the population is already over the age of 40. So they likely can't do anything at this point. They've spent $300 billion trying to get their fertility rate up. It hasn't worked. You can look at countries like Hungary, where at first the right was all like, yay. They spent a bunch of money trying to get their fertility rates up. 5% of their GDP they spent trying to get their fertility rates up. And yeah, it ticked up a little, and everyone was like, oh, big, success. But then we look at the neighboring countries that didn't spend this number, and yeah, that was just like a post-COVID bump that all of the countries in that region have. And now Hungary has its lowest fertility rate ever. So you can't really solve this by cash handouts. You can't solve this with a lot of the normal solutions that people think. We could say, oh, well, what if you had a country where like you banned pornography, where you banned gay marriage, where abortion isn't legal, where you basically have no immigration, and I'm like, that's South Korea. All of those things are true in South Korea, although abortion was made legal like 2 years ago or something in South Korea. But the point being is like they got into this problem with all of these bans. The only way you fix this problem is culturally.
All right, so let's talk about that. It's happening. It's already been happening. It's in some places it's probably going to be irreversible. You mentioned the headline. People aren't sure why. Why is it happening? I have a few ideas. I have a few theories. What are yours?
Well, before I get into this, one thing that people are going to be like is, why is this an issue? Like, why do I need to be freaked out about this? Because I want to make sure that like I do. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's sad that some people are like, well, so human race dies out. Like, that's a net, like, social justice for planet Earth. Like, this is good. Everything goes to zero. Nature is healing.
I hear this. Like, yeah. I'll go to parties in New York and I'll be like, this is, if humanity, like, if South Koreans were a species, they would categorize as critically endangered right now.
Right.
I'm like, humanity is an endangered species right now. And they're like, yeah, but is it really so bad if humanity goes extinct? And I'm like, do you understand, like, that this view has become normalized? Like, that you're in an insane death cult? Like, in any other period in history, if there was someone in a room who spoke up, is it really so bad if humanity goes extinct? Everyone else would have like turned at them and been like, oh my God, you are insane. This is like genocide talk.
Yeah.
They should be triggering those flags. But in terms of like, first you got the economic issue, which everybody doesn't really want to talk about. And I will get to your question, which is to say that historically speaking, we have lived in a world where the number of producers and consumers has been growing exponentially, and that has led to an on average growing economy because the productive capability per producer has been growing linearly due to technology, even though technology has been growing exponentially. This is for about the past 200 years. Well, if we see these decline, we're going to live in a global economy where the economy is shrinking on average, except we've taken out leverage, debt against like every layer of the economy. Like the economy, as we have structured it, just stops working. Not to mention the social security systems and the pension systems. But then we also deal with the cultural effects of this, which is to say that if you have a dominant cultural group in our society, this ultra-progressive cultural group, which is the lowest fertility rate group. We call it the urban monoculture, that is only able to replenish itself by taking people from nearby high fertility cultural groups, or demographically healthy cultural groups, not people, children mostly, because that's when people deconvert. This creates a problem if it is taking those people based on certain psychological metrics. Like if it's disproportionately taking people who are more open-minded or more economically productive, then it is going to make these groups, one, more hostile, but also less economically productive intergenerationally. And this comes to the, like, what's causing this. One is this effect that our society right now is essentially controlled by this parasitic cult, which can only survive either by taking the children from demographically healthy cultural groups or importing children from demographically healthy cultural groups. But then the second problem that we have is the biological problem. So I told you I wasn't going to get to this. We have a rapid decline in human fertility rates. One study, not just one study, it's a pretty commonly accepted study right now, shows that in the developed world, 50% of men are going to be infertile by the year 2060.
Yeah, sperm is dying. The T counts are dropping. It looks bad.
Yeah, no, so like when you look at sperm counts, they dropped something like over 50% in the last 50 years. Like imagine if our arms got 50% shorter in the last 50 years. Like people would be freaking out. And people are like, how have things gotten this bad? And I'm like, well, when the environmentalist movement started, like it was actually needed when it started. We had rivers catching on fire. People would die from going outside in London. You know, you had like the London fog. They basically cleaned up all of the superficial stuff that we saw to make nature pretty.
Yeah, but LA was really disgusting. The acid rain was over in Europe.
Yeah,
it was bad.
But they never were working on the fertility side of the issue because they wanted the population to drop. So we are at fertility rate wise as if acid rain had kept getting worse up until the 2020s, as if the London fog, as if the rivers were still burning. We are at a sort of an environmentalist apocalyptic moment for our fertility rates. But then on top of that, and a lot of people are like, oh, well, what about the economic situation, right?
Yeah.
The economic situation is basically non-existent. The less money somebody has or the less money a country has, the higher their fertility rate is going to be. What people mean when they say I can't afford to have kids is I can't afford to have kids without sacrificing my quality of life.
Quality of life. I'll have to stop drinking $20 Negronis every like 3 times a week, and I'll have to ramp down to like a beer.
Oh, well, they don't actually have a good quality of life. And this is the really interesting thing about the urban monoculture, 100%. And we can get into this, is its core pitch to people is come join us, and you will never have to experience any in-the-moment discomfort or challenges, right? It used to be, a lot of people think that it's about equality. I'm like, it's not about equality anymore. If it was about equality, it wouldn't be handing out fentanyl to people on the streets. It wouldn't be banning, test scores in California, because obviously the rich kids are still taking their standardized tests at home. It wouldn't, the Haze movement, right? The healthy at every size movement that's trying to like ban you from telling fat people, well, mostly fat women, that this is unhealthy and will kill them earlier. It's like, oh, don't do research on that. That research is offensive because it causes in the moment emotional pain, even though it causes long-term health.
No, it's our narcotic ideology, basically. It's just like numb the pain.
Yeah, well, and this is what trigger warnings are, right?
Yeah.
It is about not experiencing any in-the-moment emotional pain. Well, it turns out that this entire cultural system that they've developed leads to enormous, like, psychological deleterious effects. These people have basically like put their souls in a sandstorm, and it's left them in tatters, and they're just like herkle-durkling, as they call it, hiding under the covers, falling asleep to the sounds of their own screams, riddled with anxiety and depression, using drugs to barely, maintain a grasp on reality. They have not, like, a lot of people are like, oh, well, the people who have gone to this hedonistic urban monoculture, they must have it good. And I'm like, no, don't worry, bro. Like, God's got this. Like, they are punishing themselves. And fortunately, this does make it a little easier for me to protect my kids. Because, in the 90s, they could say, well, why don't you go out and live the party lifestyle? Look at how well all of them are doing. Look at how happy they're all doing.
They're beautiful. They're smiling. They're being paid to be cool. Like, go.
Yeah. Now, you talk to Gen Alpha and you're like, they're like, I don't want to do whatever it is that they're doing. This is an easy sell for my kid. I'm like, look online.
No.
These people are
one look at millennial culture,
yeah.
and there's no appeal. They know that the society is sort of splitting into two. There's this like really dysgenic, really dysmorphic, really just, watching a whole generation plus just kind of sliding. And I'm generalizing a little bit, but this is dominating the culture now.
Well, and you see it in the media. You go out there and you watch like Hollywood movies these days, and it just feels so soulless, like completely lacking in any human vitalism. Their emotions appear mechanical. They just lack this brightness behind their eyes, and if people are like, well, what are you talking about? So I live in Pennsylvania. If I drive a little bit and I talk to like a firebrand, like Amish family out there, you see this fire immediately behind their eyes. You see this human vitalism still there. This human vitalism still exists within the religious communities of this country. It just doesn't exist in this urban monoculture.
Yeah. So we're starting to excavate a little bit. So why is no one having babies? Well, they're kind of physically and psychologically and spiritually exhausted and decaying. So why is that happening? You could just go back to whether it's the 90s or even pretty deep into the 2000s. You still had boy bands going. You still had like Britney pre head shaving. Like, there was still this kind of energy. What do you attribute to? Technology, like geopolitics, collapse of spirituality? Like, what is it?
Right. So there's two things that we have to talk about here. One is how this like parasitic culture came to evolve. But the other thing is the misconstrual about collapsing fertility rates. People look at collapsing fertility rates and they're like, this started being a problem in around the 1970s, because that's when some countries started to fall below repopulation rate, right? Except that's just when it started being a problem. It's not when the trend of falling fertility rate started. The trend of falling fertility rate started in the 1800s. It's just been steady since then, and it became a problem when it fell below what is basically an arbitrary threshold of above repopulation rate. So it started with the transition from like the world from a feudalistic economy to an industrial and capitalist economy. We fundamentally, as a species, never figured out how to make a post-feudal economy work. And so how has it gotten as bad as it's gotten now? How did basically a cult end up taking over our country? Well, this is something we talk a lot in our book, The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, where if I take a totally secular hat here, sometimes I'm like putting on my theological hat, putting on my secular hat, putting on a secular hat. Well, if I put on a secular hat, I can look at religious cultural groups historically as sort of mimetic clusters that act as sort of an evolving software on top of humans' biological propensities, which could be like our evolving hardware, like our neurology, everything like that. And it could evolve much faster than the evolving hardware, which is how you get things like, Judaism and Islam figuring out hand washing literally hundreds of years before science figures it out. And it's also, but because these two things evolved together, this software developed many practices which improved the quality of the hardware, and then the hardware never really adapted to this. Most of these were austerity measures. These were things like pretty much in every long-lived successful cultural group in the world, you have some form of arbitrary austerity measure. For example, Lent, Ramadan, Feast of the Firstborn, all of the Buddhist like fasting ceremonies and stuff. And these likely strengthen the prefrontal pathway, the inhibitory pathways in our prefrontal cortex, which makes it easier to shut down things like intrusive thoughts, like anxiety and depression and stuff like that. And this is why you see like higher rates of mental health in religiously conservative communities. Well, anyway, as society began to develop, we began to, sort of the concept of the Chesterton fence, even within religious communities, they didn't understand why all these rules existed. So it wasn't just the secularists, it was also the religious communities. They began to take out all of the rules that didn't make explicit, like a logical, in-the-moment sense to them. And as they sort of were removing all of these Chesterton fences, two things happened. One is that one of the things that these historic cultural systems had evolved was sort of an antivirus against mimetic viruses. So these systems helped people because they helped them motivate intergenerationally high reproductive rates. Basically, it increased their biological fitness. However, there was always the possibility the mimetic system could arise that just sort of like those viruses that like take over ants and then brainwash them and then use them to just spread the fungus.
Right.
They didn't increase their reproductive rate, but basically just turned them into tools that were just meant to convert other people to this mimetic system. Now, of course, this mimetic system couldn't survive intergenerationally, but it was always a risk. And this is what we call a mimetic virus. Well, when you, in biology, if you have a bunch of like immunocompromised people in like a hospital or something like that, this is where super viruses emerge. Because you've got a bunch of people, like way more than you would ever have in a historic evolutionary context, in a small environment, always compromised immune systems.
Or a neighborhood. I mean, super gonorrhea, it's a thing happening for the same reasons, basically.
Well, that's what the internet was. And that's what the megacities we developed were for viruses. And a few different viruses. There's not just one, but the urban monoculture has been the most successful of these viruses. And then under the urban monoculture, small viruses have emerged basically anywhere where they have a protected class, because that's very good at protecting a group from like the antibodies that would otherwise attack it. So you see this was in certain parts of the trans movement, or was in certain parts of the psychology movement, or was in certain parts of the like DEI movement and stuff like that. Basically, if you have these like really deleterious mimetic structures that normally society would call out and be like, hey, this is hurting people, we need to stop this. If you can, like in a body, one thing that tumors will do to protect themselves is they will signal to the body that they're actually like super important and useful. And that's why they'll get like blood vessels growing all around them to give them like the most energy, because it's the most important thing. Right. Well, these cancerous nodes will form within organizations or within social structures and say, well, if you get rid of me, then you cause racism. And like the social structure of our society today is like, oh no, we can't do that, right? Yeah. So we must give them the most resources, or you will cause transphobia, and or you will cause, and so
someone will hurt deep down inside
Right. And so nobody's really critical when these groups begin to go off the rail in the same way that you would have normal self-correction within these populations. The first place this really happened was within the psychology community, when there was that whole movement of, to destigmatize seeing a psychologist, which was good, but then it became do not ever criticize someone for what's happening when they see a psychologist. Mm-hmm. One of the crazy moments for me when I realized that modern psychology had become a cult was when I was walking with three women. And one of the women goes to the other one, well, I'd never date a man who wasn't seeing a psychologist. The other two women agreed sagely. Right. And I was like, wait, this woman is seeing someone who has incepted into them that you cannot be psychologically healthy without paying for their profession. That's dependency.
Yeah, 100%. And an intentional, conscious or not, I don't know, but replacement for I'm an Orthodox Christian. The church is a hospital. It's a spiritual hospital.
Exactly.
And so when that gets scooped out and replaced with something that's just an engine for more of this techno-capital that you're describing, which has been working on us since at least the 1800s, since industrialization, we see what happens.
Yeah, if we contrast psychology, and most religious systems had their own psychological systems. Yeah. So let's contrast the Catholic system with the modern psychological movement. So the modern psychological movement, you go to a psychologist and they look for trauma, and then they find the trauma and they're like, oh, you need to keep seeing me to address this trauma, which is actually very similar to what Scientologists were doing in the 80s. Modern psychology is actually much more similar to a Scientology than it is to psychology in the 90s.
Don't tell the Scientologists.
It's funny that they've converged on this pathway. And I don't think any of this was malevolent, and we can get to this in a second. But then you look at the Catholic system, right? Okay, so what do you do with the Catholic system? Well, one is they depersonalize it, right? So they depersonalize it so that the individual who you are seeing cannot manipulate you to take advantage of you as easily. You have a relationship with the vague concept of a church. And they're operating off of what is basically a script for the types of things they can say, which reduces the types of things they can ask for you. They don't say that your sins aren't really your fault. They don't blame your sins on some historic past thing. They're like, yeah, you actually sinned. That is actually bad. You should internalize this and do this thing, this concrete thing you can do to not feel as bad about it, but know that it's still a sin. That's an incredibly psychologically healthy system when contrasted with the modern psychologist movement.
Repentance. Imagine. You don't have to be in analysis for the rest of your life.
Responsibility and repentance, right?
Instead of 10 medications that you can also never get off of for the rest of your life. Not without having a complete psychic break.
Yeah. Sorry, I had a tangent there I was going to continue with, but I forgot what it was.
Yeah, that's okay. When you look at the way that this has been institutionalized, and you look at the way that it's now de rigueur to say, have no kids, be in therapy forever, numb the pain, you have to ask yourself, what is the political basis for a response to this problem that is actually going to break through? Yes. If we're running out of time, if techno-capital has been turning us into people without a future, some of the leading proponents of pulling out of the tailspin say look, we just need to start cloning people. We need to start growing babies out of the lab, external wombs, surrender everything to daddy techno-capital, and the only way that the human race can survive is to just mass produce human clones. That seems like it's only going to worsen the problem, that it's only going to spiritually alienate people more from their own humanity, and that we're just going to, turning into machines is not an answer to the problem of how the automation of life has been taking away our future, right?
So two points to make here. Some groups are going to do what you are saying. And if your group cannot compete with those groups, your group is going to be crushed. We've been living under the Pax de Romana of the urban monoculture for a while now, and it has left people... Okay, well, before I get to this, because I want to talk about the trial of the Lotus Eaters and everything like that. But before I talk about that, the point that I wanted to finish, because I remembered what it was, which is none of this is intentional. The reason they target people between 15 and 21, really aggressively, is because that's when people deconvert from their birth culture. That's when people leave their religion most often. And so the iterations of the urban monoculture that focused on those factions just outcompeted the ones that didn't. Same with the psychologists. The psychologists that developed dependency made more money, developed more ads than the ones who didn't. So there's no malevolence here. It's just this horde of the fallen. This sort of ants that have had their brains eaten by a fungus operating on simple code.
Well, all religions are not created equal. I mean, you have had, cults, which you mentioned already, other religions where it's not about perpetuating the human race on planet Earth. It's about sacrifice the children. It's about everyone stop having sex and wait for nirvana. There are these different kinds of religions, and what you seem to be teeing up here is a situation where technology accelerated to a point where, with the internet and with sort of the urban monoculture, it's created these nodes that are almost like sort of cancers or tumors that cause people to adopt sort of religious frameworks or cult frameworks where their spirituality is now organized around bringing the human race to an end, ushering in the end times, rather than the opposite.
Yeah, so my dream for humanity, and I believe God's end goal for humanity, is to become a vast interstellar empire. And when I look at humanity today, this is where, in a way, demographic collapse and this trial that we're going through as a species is a blessing. Do I really want the average man of today to be the humanity that populates the stars? I mean, no, we are a fallen species at this point to an extent. And it is good that we are undergoing this sort of cleansing, this spiritual cleansing where these groups are sterilizing themselves and removing themselves. But we have entered this incredibly difficult trial. God said that he would, never again destroy the earth in floods. And some people say, well, then he'll do it with fire next time. And he has allowed those who lack mental fortitude to burn themselves on the bonfire of their own vanity. When I talk about this concept of the trial of the lotus eaters, it's not just that you have these dangerous mimetic groups. It's that the trials that humanity needs to undergo and fortify himself against have become more difficult. At any moment, I can go and I can engage with all of the pleasures that anyone could ever want now. I can live my fantasy life as an adventurer in a video game, and I can date an AI girlfriend. And these things are only going to become harder when we have, fully 3D environments that people can go into and live their perfect life without any real challenges. I can adopt to social groups where I need to adhere to no austerity and where I'm constantly affirmed for whatever I want to believe about myself. And this, when we talk about the lotus eaters, for people who don't know, in Greek myths, this is this island that's like a trial where if you eat this thing that has so much pleasure in it, you'll never be able to leave. Mm-hmm. And this is what we are going through right now as a species. And there are two pathways through the trial of the lotus eaters. One pathway is to take hot pokers and burn out your eyes so you don't need to see the temptation. This pathway is incredibly efficient. Many groups are doing this, is to disengage from technology altogether. The problem is that at the other side of the trial of the lotus eaters, there's going to be a battle royale. When the Pax de Romana of the urban monoculture falls, when they have the end of this, okay, you guys don't fight again, everyone's going to start fighting again. And the people with the AI drone swarms are going to mop up the people with the assault weapons, right? But the other pathway through the trial of the lotus eaters, there is two others. One is the extreme techno-futurism, which is a dangerous pathway, and those will be one of the groups that we need to be able to compete with in the future. But then the other is to fortify our spirits, to adopt austerity, to adopt discipline, and to see the temptations all around us, engage with technology enough so that we are technologically proficient and moving forwards, but also able to defend ourselves when we get to the other side, that we still have this spiritual vitalism.
Yeah, we need to discipline our technology as much as we discipline ourselves. I mean, to me, it seems like, don't we need to humble ourselves and discipline ourselves spiritually to a degree that we actually can rebuild some baseline of trust that we can function as human beings on planet Earth before we even open up the question about conquering galaxies?
Well, I mean, look, these other groups we're going to face them. These ultra techno groups, techno-fascists, these groups are definitely. So this is one of the things, if it turns out that every country where we have freedom and prosperity and education ends up being below repopulation rate and well below repopulation rate, those things just won't exist in the future. And I mentioned this to people. There's this famous quote in The Guardian where I'm like, look, if in every country where we have any degree of gender equality, it's well below repopulation rate, there isn't going to be gender equality in the future. And we already see places like China, taking away women's rights in order to increase their fertility rate. And they said, oh, that sounds an awful lot like a threat to me. And I'm like, are you like a child? Like I say, don't touch the stove or you'll burn your hand. Even if we don't develop it here in the US, in places like China, they are likely going to go the authoritarian paths where they are going to create human birthing farms, where they are going to create, mass productions of humans, sort of assembly line humans, right? Or some companies that need to produce competent individuals are likely going to go the route of producing their own humans. But oh no, what if they decide to not work at the company? Well, we should probably produce them without a few proteins that we, keep on hand.
And anyone who supports globalization is inherently going to support merging with that kind of techno-fascist Chinese civilization that you're describing.
They're pretty terrified by these groups as well. They actually want to merge with like the barbarian groups. We can talk about the barbarian groups in a second.
The theory that I've heard is China is going to like floor the accelerator, and then the U.S. is just going to port wokeness on top, and then it's going to be globalization.
No, because we have the other groups. You see, the thing is, and I believe this, I believe we will win because I believe that the groups that take these fascist approaches in the humans that they create, they will need to intrinsically limit the fire within their hearts, their passion, their spirit, their ambition, because you can't have a bunch of super ambitious people under a fascist hierarchy. And I think that the groups that find ways for pluralistic groups with different perspectives on realities, but this fire for life and this fire for ambition and a degree of technological engagement to work together, those are the groups that will eventually end. But now we need to talk about the barbarian hordes, because that will be the vast majority of humanity when we exit the Garden of the Lotus Eaters. So the most successful cultural strategy today to get one's fertility rates higher is to disengage with technology to some extent, but mostly adopt extreme levels of xenophobia to prevent members of your group from interacting with outsiders, to disengage with innovation, to disengage with economic productivity, because the less wealth you have, the more kids you have typically. And these groups have been incredibly reproductively successful. And they exist across all groups. They exist within Muslim populations and within some Christian groups and within some Jewish groups. And these are the groups, particularly the Muslim iterations of these groups, that the urban monoculture has allied itself really closely with. And it is perplexing to me. I can get into like why I think they allied with these groups, but it's quite a tangent.
You got to hoover up all the daughters of the fundamentalist Muslims and turn them into wokies, right? That's what we see on college campus, right?
Well, yeah, that is genuinely their plan, and they think they're going to do that. Like, recently, my family went viral for disciplining our children.
Well, I was going to say, as usual, against my will, I was reading The Guardian, and their portrayal of, I guess you gave your 2-year-old a little smack for misbehaving at dinner.
He almost kicked over a table at a restaurant.
Yeah,
so I
and they were depicting that as I don't know if it was more fascism or barbarism in their eyes, but they were really horrified.
Oh, they were absolutely horrified. And they even say in the article, oh, he's back to playing within 30 seconds and laughing. And he, immediately after I punished him, I said, I love you, which they recorded in the article. And I said, but you need to be a good boy when you're in restaurants. They were like, oh my God, how could a child, be subject to discipline, right? And it fits this urban monoculture mindset of no negative emotions at any point. When even the research, there was this great study done in 2023, very large meta study called Parental Punishment, Don't Throw the Baby Out with the Bathwater. And what it turned out is it was considered like scientific consensus. The science is closed. Whenever anyone says the science is closed, they're not talking about science, they're talking about dogma. Back in like the 80s and 90s, there were a bunch of studies that had these giant sample sizes that were like corporal punishment punishment is always bad. And it turned out that they were basically fraudulent. So what they did is they had these giant sample sizes, but they didn't match them. So they would just say, okay, if a child is being punished, they are in the corporal punishment data set. And if a child is not being punished, they are in the non-corporal punishment data set. Well, for our family, that would mean our daughter is in the non-corporal punishment segment because we never need to punish her like that. And our son, they're in the corporal punishment segment. And it's like, and see, they're disbehaving more often. And when you actually correct for this, it turns out that corporal punishment actually helps. It's like, no duh. Every culture in human history ever that has been successful and survived a long time has adopted these systems. And it also just makes sense. Like, you look at the instance with my kid, and because, you need to escalate. When kids can't understand the concept of death between like 2 and 4, you need some way to like escalate certain situations as more important than other situations. And the only way to do that, other than, especially when you have a ton of kids, like we have, a high fertility family, other than physically, is to do it emotionally, which is like so much worse, right? To make the kid feel like they are unloved in some way, or that they're being rejected in some way, which historically means like, I'm going to die in the wilderness, right? Like, and instead, I'm able to immediately punish him lightly, but then say, I still love you, without ever becoming emotionally escalated. Right. And I think that this leads to so many psychologically deleterious effects. One, you're teaching people that the way to deal with their boundaries being crossed is emotional escalation, which of course you see on the far left, screaming at everything, like no emotional control. But then two, when people do not encounter negative stimuli during their childhood, they become incredibly sensitive to negative stimuli as adults. What is trigger warnings? I can't deal with negative stimuli, even light negative stimuli, without having an emotional breakdown. You are long-term creating a fortitude of spirit by doing things like this. And it's just like, we as a society, and I agree that like, there are forms of corporal punishment where it is basically abuse, like parents causing pain for pain's sake.
Well, it's a spiritual discernment issue. I mean, you have a spectrum, and everyone knows that if your kid is reaching for that burner, knock them down if you have to keep them away. And how when, it's really context dependent, and how when you've gone too far and when you're tipping over into bad behavior. That's something that you have to learn over the course of generations, through experience, through loving family relationships. That's where that stuff comes from. People want an algorithm. People want a rule book. People want, it to be codified, how to behave and how to have all these interactions, microaggressions, micro justice, whatever it is. They want it all totally broken down, and that's not the way being human is.
Well, yeah, and this is the problem. When I say it's like a dangerous cult, right? Like, people are like, no, it's not a cult. It's just secularism. They trust the science. But then when the science disagrees with the cult's mandates, like the big meta study on corporal punishment, they're just like, well, I don't trust that science. I mean, the science now is turning against them. There was a great study that came out this year in 2024 called The Development of Gender Nonconformity Development in Adolescence and Early Adulthood. And this came out in 2024. It is this great longitudinal study that showed, to the left's horror, that of 11-year-olds who are discontent with their birth gender, over 90% are perfectly content with it by the time they are 26.
Yeah.
And
I think they know deep down. I really think they do. I mean, I usually don't quote Steve Bannon for a couple different reasons. No offense to Steve, but the one thing that he said that no one really wants to deal with. Once upon a time, he said, we got to have a hard landing. If we don't have a hard landing, we're never going to get out of this. And I don't think that's just true for like the political economy or forever. I think it's true in the human heart. And so many of these people who are just trying so hard to numb the pain and like stack the pharmaceuticals and have the trigger warnings and do the hormone therapy, all the insanity. They know deep down that it's not going to work, and they're not going to get to that point until they hit rock bottom, or whatever you want to call it. And sometimes that's what it takes in order to have that metanoia, that change of heart, that spiritual reawakening.
So I don't know if they'll recognize. I mean, the cult is actually incredibly efficient in the way it's structured. It's very good at building mechanisms which prevent them from encountering disconfirming information. Yeah. So, for example, one of the systems that it uses is it says, so once we have identified someone as sort of immune to the cult, right? Not only can you not interact with them, but you can't interact with anyone who's interacted with them. That's why they're always like, oh, Malcolm, well, he's never said anything wrong himself, but look at these people who he's talked to. And we've caught them saying bad things, so you can't interact with him.
Right.
This is an incredibly effective mechanism. Or that if somebody challenges you on these issues, they are literally trying to genocide you. Like with the trans stuff, right? Like, it's if you challenge any of the dominant narratives around this, their take is they are trying to genocide me and kill children, right? That's the way that their brain immediately processes this information. Or with the Hayes movement, right? They are trying to genocide fat people by helping us get skinny. Like it is framed in these terms because these terms give them a moral mandate to basically act in the most monstrous ways possible towards the outgroup. And the way that they perceive the outgroup is genuinely Nazi-like. Like, I want to talk about how, like, Nazism has reemerged. Because when I look at the modern urban monoculture, I don't think it descended from Nazism, but I think it has reconverged around basically the exact political position that was Nazism. So, like, what was Nazism, right? Like, Nazism believed that you should have a state. So, in communism, they believed the goal was broadly equality, right? Like, in that the state should have control of the economic structure of a country and then distribute the wealth as equally as possible. It didn't work that way, but that was like the idea.
Everyone's in servitude. Everyone will be the same.
The idea of capitalism is if you allow people to compete, you're going to get organically forming, healthy companies and everything like that. That was the idea. Not the way it worked, but the idea. Fascism, people often put all these little qualifiers on what fascism is to hide what it really was. Fascism was just the idea that the state should have control over all the economic capital and then use the money to promote an ideological agenda, or the forces of the economy to promote an ideological agenda. And then if you want to add caveats to that, that ideological agenda should sort people into a racial caste system in which certain ethnic groups have a higher right to human dignity than other ethnic groups, and that at the bottom of that caste system should be the Jews. And I'm like,
well, this is more than an ideology, right? There's a spiritual component here that can't be eliminated from the equation.
Right. But that's just some modern progressive party. They have a belief that certain human lives are worth more dignity than other human lives based on an ethnic hierarchy. I mean, in Pennsylvania, in my home state, where my wife is running for office right now, when they were handing out COVID vaccines, and keep in mind, they thought these vaccines were saving lives. Forget this. The way that they chose to hand it out priority-wise was not based on how ill somebody was, but their ethnic group, with certain ethnic groups getting access to the vaccines before other ethnic groups.
Historically disadvantaged. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're worshiping justice as an idol, you are going to become obsessed with these tiny differentiators between who is at what point in the rank order of society at all times.
But it's not justice. It's not. It is a Nazism, and it hurts these groups that they think that they're helping. There was a great study done recently that looked at IQ differences between white and black populations, and they were smallest in the regions that were republicly controlled for generations. Why would that be the case? Well, of course, these affirmative action programs are causing cultural systems to be adopted within the African American community, which hurts these communities.
Yeah.
But the point being is this is literal Nazism. It is a belief that, humans should be sorted by ethnic groups, and that the bottom ethnic group should be the Jews, and that we need to, basically get rid of the Jews. And I love it when progressives are like, no, we just want to get rid of the Zionists. And I'm like, well, depending on the study you're looking at, it's between like 85 to 98% of Jews are Zionists. So if you're like, I just want to get rid of 98% of them, I don't hate them broadly. It's like, I don't want to get rid of Christians. I just want to get rid of the people who believe that Jesus was the Son of God.
Right.
It's like, and it's like, Jews, why do they want a Jewish state? What could have ever happened in their history that would make them believe they'd only be safe if they had their own state?
Crazy,
it's like literally everything in their history.
Yeah. All right, we got a few minutes left. Yeah. I want to home in on what I think is the real controversy, which is there's a lot of talk these days, not just about this, but other stuff too, and it applies to this extra specially, which is basically fight fire with fire. We don't have the luxury of not getting sucked into this kind of mimetic rivalry with people. Yeah. China's doing all this stuff, and if we don't do exactly what China does, if we don't become China, then China's going to beat us. And I think it's happening here too. We got to clone the people. We got to replace the family with just this sort of algorithmically structured kind of Borg of humans who have been incorporated into this techno-capital system. That to me is the real controversy, the real challenge. How do we prevent ourselves from getting sucked into this dialectic of sort of mimetic rivalry, which is if we don't do what China does, then China's going to beat us when it comes to children, childbirth demographics?
I mean, realistically, I don't think China is going to beat us. I think that they will be one of the factions that dies. I think that most of the factions that are going to be successful are actually going to come out of places like the United States. And this is a great thing about demographic collapse. You know, historically, the groups that were able to exercise their power on other groups were the groups that were able to do it by force. You know, I remember in Korea, I was looking around one day when I was living there, and I was like, well, when there's 5% of the population living here, who's going to live in these skyscrapers, right? Like, who's going to, you know, I was like, you could import immigrants, but from where? Like, not Japan, their fertility rate's desperately low. Not from China, their fertility rate's desperately low.
And give the immigrants 2 generations, and they're right in the same pocket.
And they'll be right in the same pocket, yeah. And so then I look at this situation, and I'm like, it's crazy to think that Japan was able to motivate its population to go out and murder, you know, hundreds of millions of people to attempt to spread their cultural influence, but they can't motivate them to have kids. And one time I was saying this around somebody, and they were like, yeah, but it's a lot easier to murder someone than it is to raise a child. And I was like, you are absolutely right. Yeah. That's the truth. Yeah. The challenge that God has given us within our generation is so much harder than many of the previous challenges, but it's something that our ancestors were able to live up to. I love it when people are complaining about this generation having it harder than our parents' generation. I'm like, did you know in the 1800s, the average American woman was having 7 kids? Mm-hmm. That means for every woman who was having no kids, there was somebody else having 14 kids. Mm-hmm. Like, we have it so easy compared to our distant ancestors. But anyway, we're sort of at this crux of human history right now, where even most of the old religious groups, like people are like, oh, you know, you got to go back to traditional religion. And I'm like, look, your average Catholic majority country is at a fertility rate of only 1.3 in Europe right now. Latin America is having a uniquely high fertility decline in their Catholic majority. And I was actually trying to find the Catholic fertility rate in the US, and I found a study showing it was 1.62, which would be below the average American fertility rate. Like, oh my God. Then I found that this study was done in 1992. I'm like, so it's worse now. So different groups, like just going back to the old ways, while something like the old ways can have some protective capabilities, we do need to continue to evolve. And that's what the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion is about. Is like, how do we fight this mimetic war? Because right now, the people that will make up the future of humanity are going to be the small churches and families and cultural groups that can come up with a way to intergenerationally motivate high fertility while still staying engaged with technology. And what the pronatalist movement really is a call. It's a lighthouse for an alliance of those groups that are willing to have people that are different from them still exist in this world. Yeah. And I know that we will win. I mean, I believe that it is humanity's manifest destiny that we win, but it is also our responsibility, just because you know, the challenges that face us are harsh. I think that that's a great thing. I think that we are blessed through the sheer magnitude of the challenges that we face. I mean, how lucky could I be to be alive in a time when there is genuinely good guys, people who are fighting for like a pluralistic, flourishing future humanity, and then against a force that wants all humans dead, or to, you know, and this is the thing when people are like complaining about like the transhumanists and stuff like that. It's important to remember that the transhumanists are largely in 2 groups. One group is on our side, one group is against us. The group that's against us are the life extensioners. They basically want to create a society that's run by like an everlasting boomer class. And then there's the group that's on our side, which are like the Elons and stuff like that, who are like, yes, we should engage, or us. Like I would think my family is, like, we engage in genetic selection with our embryos and stuff like that, which is horrifying to some people, but like it doesn't affect other groups.
Yeah,
like,
I don't know. I mean, I'd rather have like an extra 50 years of life than have like a collective consciousness formed by chips implanted in everyone's brains.
Well, I mean, we've got to think about the alternative. So this is also really interesting. You had a guest on that was talking about the effective accelerationists versus the effective altruists.
Yes,
and the core difference between these 2 groups, just shorthand within the groups that's understood, effective accelerationists are the conservatives, the effective altruists are the progressives. And it largely has to do with their response to AI. The effective altruists generally want to end AI development. And a lot of people hear that and they think that this is like an alignment with a conservative perspective, because they haven't understood how they want to end it. How do you end AI development if there's multiple countries in the world that could independently be doing AI development?
Yeah.
Well, you need to create a one world government or an AI lattice. And then it's like, well, how do you keep an individual from doing this in the privacy of their house? Well, then you need some sort of dumb AI lattice around the entire world, constantly monitoring people. And why not program a few little aspects of our culture into this now that we're able to monitor everyone all the time? So, I mean, the end state is really terrifying. And I think that there is this risk of accidentally othering the people who are on our side.
Well, I mean, there's always a bit of a risk, especially when you're trying to just scrape a coalition together because we're stuck in like rebel mindset. Probably a story for another day. But I mean, look, for me, it's like attend to your own spiritual health first and then maybe consider the question of what we should do with AI. Because if you try to shortcut around that, it seems to me you're destined to get the wrong answer.
Well, we don't have a lot of time. I mean, timelines are short now. The world is changing. We are at the crux of human history. We are the generation that decides probably more than any generation in human history, even more than the greatest generation, what our species ends up becoming. And it is on to us to take up this mantle and not to shirk it and complaining about like modern, political issues, for example, Ann Coulter, you had her on recently, like concerned about immigration rates and stuff like that. But these immigrants have like very low fertility. Their fertility drops. The Latin American fertility rate in the United States is dropping much faster than the white fertility rate in the US. They're basically going to be irrelevant in the grand civilizational game. And yet she has no kids of her own, We need to, all of us, be taking up this responsibility, first and foremost ourselves, and protect our own children from this parasitic cultural group that wants to utilize them and that wants to essentially take them culturally and maybe literally castrate them, then march them through the streets in triumphs that in their, luxury and audacity, humble even the triumphs of Rome's of their cultural enemies. It is scary. That's what they do. They take the children of these immigrants, they erase their culture, then they march them through the streets in what is essentially, I say, laundered white pride events. Because that's what it is. It's European cultural pride. That's what all of this came out of, with the old European imperialist culture. And it's just continuing like a paperclip maximizer, erase suffering. And how do you eventually erase suffering? And this is something you're going to hear more and more. It may sound crazy here, but I guarantee it, you're going to hear this more and more in the public discourse. You erase suffering by erasing humans. And that's what the anti-natalist 100%. Movement is advocating for.
Well, I definitely agree with all that. There's just so much here, and we'll be watching, so make sure you behave. Malcolm Collins, thanks so much.
Oh yeah, come join us on Basecamp, our own YouTuber podcast, and I would always happy to come back, and I have really enjoyed talking to you, and I think you're doing great stuff with this show.
Appreciate it. All right, that's all the time we got. Until next time around. So if you are watching on YouTube, give us that like, give us the subscribe. Comment below. Let me know who you would like to see me interview. Until next time, this is 0 Hour. I am James Poulos, and may God have mercy on us all.